This stark number represents the ultimate horrifying fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy's aircraft carrier crewmen. It is a statistic of near total annihilation. The Empire, in its relentless drive for dominance, had constructed the most formidable and elite naval air force ever witnessed, a weapon of unparalleled reach and precision. Yet, by the final, desperate summer of World War II, that same force had been virtually erased from existence. Its ships lay broken and scattered across the vast floor of the Pacific, and almost every one of the highly trained men who gave it life was dead. How does the most powerful fleet in the Pacific transform into a colossal, floating graveyard in the span of a mere 3 years? The answer is far darker and more complex than a simple tale of battlefield loss. It is a story woven from fatal flaws in doctrine, catastrophic design choices, and a cultural faith and spirit that ultimately collided with the unyielding realities of industrial warfare. The arithmetic of annihilation: 91%. This was the final, grim death toll for the men who served aboard Japan's fleet carriers by August 1945. The Pacific Ocean had become a sprawling cemetery of steel, littered with the skeletal remains of once proud floating fortresses. For every 100 young men who had eagerly boarded these symbols of imperial power, sailors, pilots, mechanics, and officers, only 9 would ever again glimpse the shores of their homeland. The rest met their ends in a myriad of terrible ways, consumed by raging infernos, suffocated by thick black smoke, or vanishing into the deep, dark waters that closed over their ship's burning decks. One must visualize the final moments of such a vessel. A single, well-placed bomb penetrates the flight deck. In an instant, hell is unleashed. The initial explosion rips through the confined space of the hangar deck, which is typically crammed with aircraft that have been fully fueled and armed for combat. The blast ignites aviation fuel, transforming narrow corridors and workspaces into raging rivers of fire. The very air becomes poisonous, superheated to unimaginable temperatures. Men, trapped below, have few avenues of escape. Those who manage to leap overboard in a desperate bid for survival often find the surface of the ocean itself ablaze, coated with burning fuel oil. Their final screams are drowned out by the deafening roar of the conflagration and the groan of twisting metal. These catastrophic losses were not merely the result of bad luck or superior enemy tactics. They were, in fact, the predictable and tragic consequences of deliberate choices. Choices embedded in a rigid military doctrine, in specific and often reckless ship design principles, and in a blind, almost religious faith that the Japanese fighting spirit, or Yamato Damashi, could overcome any material disadvantage. The ascent of a naval colossus, Japan had entered the war possessing the world's finest carrier force. Its pilots were subjected to years of the most grueling and selective training, forging them into instruments of unparalleled skill. Its crews were drilled to a state of perfection, and its ships, like the converted battlecruisers Akagi and Kaga, were marvels of naval engineering for their time. This formidable strength was born from a combination of geopolitical circumstance and burning ambition. Restricted by international naval treaties from matching the battleship strength of Western powers, Japanese strategists saw in the aircraft carrier a path to asymmetric supremacy. Their guiding principle was Kantai Kessen, the concept of a single, decisive fleet battle that would crush the enemy and secure the Pacific. To deliver this knockout blow, Japan poured its national soul into its carrier arm. These vessels were more than mere weapons of war. They were potent symbols of a nation demanding its place as a first-rate power, determined to shatter the dominance of the West. Propaganda films depicted them as unsinkable, gleaming cities of steel, unstoppable in their grace and power. Yet, beneath this polished exterior festered a dangerous assumption. Japan's naval leadership genuinely believed that spiritual strength could outweigh material weakness. If their sailors and pilots were imbued with the ancient code of the warrior, Bushido, and embraced a willingness to die for the emperor, then victory was assured, This philosophy created a stark contrast with their future adversary. While the United States would rotate its veteran pilots home to train new generations, Japan kept its aces on the front lines until they were killed. While the U.S. Navy invested heavily in damage control schools, advanced firefighting equipment, and resilient ship designs, the Imperial Japanese Navy often glorified sacrifice, leaving firefighting to buckets and raw courage. The arithmetic was already stacked against them. American industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's, capable of producing carriers, aircraft, and trained men at a rate the island nation could never hope to match. Japan's entire strategy was a grand gamble. Win the war with one devastating blow before this industrial imbalance could become decisive. The crucible of war and the unraveling of a force. In the early months of the conflict, the Japanese carrier fleet seemed invincible. The audacious attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 appeared to validate their entire doctrine. In just 2 hours, 6 carriers of the Kido Butai had launched over 350 aircraft and left the U.S. Pacific Fleet a smoldering ruin. The carriers then spearheaded a whirlwind of conquest across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies. To the young men serving aboard them, these ships felt like cities of destiny, eternal and invulnerable. Life aboard these floating fortresses was a paradox of rigid discipline and intense anticipation. Between battles, the routine was endless. Cleaning decks, polishing brass, maintaining aircraft, and conducting drills. Yet, a palpable sense of purpose thrummed through the ships. They were the chosen instruments of imperial expansion. However, the cracks that had been present from the beginning began to widen. Each victory came at the cost of experienced pilots and aircrew, losses that were not being replaced with men of equal skill. The machinery of war was grinding down its finest components without a plan for renewal. The turning point arrived at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. There, in a stunning reversal of fortune, 4 frontline Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were sent to the bottom by American dive bombers. The battle was not merely a loss of ships, it was the annihilation of Japan's irreplaceable core of veteran naval aviators. These were the men who had trained for a decade, the masters of carrier warfare. They were cut down in a matter of hours. The United States could recover from such losses. Japan could not. The tide had turned irrevocably. The downward spiral accelerated into a freefall. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, the disparity in skill and technology became horrifyingly evident. Waves of inexperienced Japanese pilots, many with only rudimentary training, were systematically slaughtered by battle-hardened American aviators and a wall of radar-directed anti-aircraft fire. The sky became a slaughterhouse. In the midst of this, the brand-new carrier Taiho, the pride of the fleet, was sunk by a single torpedo hit. The damage was initially manageable, but flawed design and poor damage control procedures allowed gasoline vapors to permeate the ship. A single spark triggered a cataclysmic explosion that tore the mighty vessel apart. The final descent into the abyss. By 1945, the concept of the Japanese carrier as an offensive weapon was dead. The remaining ships, often unfinished hulls or converted vessels, were largely immobilized in port due to a critical lack of aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots. Their final, tragic role was to serve as static launch platforms for kamikaze missions, a grim and symbolic end for a force once built on precision and skill. Sailors now served as caretakers for floating coffins, watching as young pilots took off on one-way missions, knowing their own fate was likely to be just as final. When American aircraft finally located these last carriers, like the Amagi at Kure Naval Base, they were destroyed at their moorings, never having fired a shot in anger. The mighty Shinano, the largest carrier in the world at the time, was sunk on her maiden voyage by a solitary American submarine, a testament to tragically incompetent damage control and a rushed construction process. The legacy of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm is one of profound tragedy. It was a force born of brilliance and ambition, but doomed by a fatal cocktail of strategic hubris, logistical blindness, and a doctrine that valued sacrifice over survival. The 91% death rate is not just a statistic. It is the human cost of a system that, in the end, consumed its own. The carriers that had once revolutionized naval warfare now rest in the eternal darkness of the deep, serving as silent, rusting monuments to the ultimate truth that no amount of courage and spirit can long prevail against the relentless arithmetic of industrial might, technological adaptation, and the unforgiving nature of modern war. The silence that followed the surrender in August 1945 was not merely an absence of gunfire, it was a void where a generation of naval prowess had once been. The homecoming, for the pitifully few who experienced it, was a somber and isolating affair. There were no victory parades, no cheering crowds. The 9%, the survivors, returned to a nation in ashes, their own internal landscapes scarred as deeply as their cities. These men carried with them memories that language could scarcely contain. They remembered the specific, sickening sound of a flight deck buckling under a bomb's impact, the sight of friends, their uniforms melting into their skin, stumbling through smoke-filled passageways, the desperate, clawing struggle in water thick with oil and flame, and perhaps most haunting of all, the ghostly quiet that would descend after the inferno had passed, broken only by the soft, persistent lapping of waves against a dying ship's hull. They returned to families who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, who believed their sons and husbands were part of an invincible force. The survivors found themselves unable to reconcile the glorious myth with the horrific reality they had witnessed. Speaking of the terror, the chaos, and the systemic failures that doomed their comrades, felt like a betrayal of both the dead and the nation's fragile pride. So many chose silence, burying their trauma deep within, where it festered for decades. The wreckage of doctrine and the cold, hard truth. In the years that followed, military historians and strategists, both in Japan and abroad, began to dissect the corpse of the Imperial carrier fleet with clinical precision. The autopsy revealed a cascade of failures, the cult of the offensive. The entire carrier doctrine was a rapier, designed for a single, perfect thrust. It possessed no backup plan, no concept of a war of attrition. When the decisive battle at Midway failed to materialize as planned, the entire strategic foundation crumbled. The fleet was not built to absorb punishment, only to deliver it. The industrial chasm. The pre-war gamble completely misjudged the American arsenal of democracy. The United States didn't just build more ships, it built an entire new navy. The Essex-class carriers, rolling out of shipyards with metronomic regularity, were faster, better protected, and more technologically advanced than their Japanese counterparts. The war became a contest between a master swordsman and a factory that produced armored bulldozers. The outcome was inevitable. The fatal flaws in steel. The design philosophy of Japanese carriers prioritized offensive capacity above all else. To carry more aircraft, hangars were open-structured and integral to the ship's hull, making them vulnerable to blast propagation. Aviation fuel systems, dubbed the Achilles heel of the fleet, were extensive and poorly protected. Lack of armored flight decks and state-of-the-art damage control equipment, like efficient foam sprayers and well-trained, dedicated firefighting teams, turned survivable hits into death sentences. The loss of the Taiho and Shinano were not mere misfortunes. They were perfect demonstrations of engineering malpractice. The squandered inheritance. The most catastrophic and irreplaceable loss was human. The veteran pilots of 1941 were a national treasure, their skills honed over years of combat experience in China and relentless training. Their wholesale destruction at Midway and in the Solomons campaign created a vacuum. The rushed training programs that followed produced pilots who were, in the cruel words of one American pilot, easy meat. They were sent into the fray with barely the ability to take off and land, let alone dogfight with seasoned American aviators. The system, in its desperate hunger for warm bodies, was sending its children to die. Echoes in the deep today, the legacy of these lost leviathans endures on the ocean floor. The wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Shōkaku have been discovered in recent years, resting in the crushing darkness of the abyss. Remote vehicles glide over their silent decks, cameras capturing ghostly images of anti-aircraft guns still pointing skyward, of Zero fighters entombed in their hangars. These are not just archaeological sites, they are war graves, hallowed ground for the nations that lost their sons within them. For modern Japan, the story of its carrier fleet is a permanent and painful part of its national identity. It is a cautionary tale about the limits of military power, the dangers of strategic arrogance, and the immense human cost when a nation's ambitions outstrip its resources and its wisdom. The ghosts of the 91% serve as a silent reminder. The final, profound lesson of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier arm is one that resonates far beyond the context of World War II. It is a timeless truth about the nature of conflict. That courage, no matter how fierce, and spirit, no matter how resolute, are ultimately just components of a much larger equation. They cannot float a sinking ship, they cannot extinguish a fuel fire, and they cannot replace a trained pilot. In the end, the Pacific did not care for Japan's dreams of empire. It listened only to the cold, impartial laws of physics, economics, and industrial logic. The sea, which had borne the carriers to glory, patiently and ruthlessly received them back, leaving behind only a statistic, 91%, a number that echoes through history as a somber testament to the price of hubris and the futility of war waged against reality itself.